The strangest part is not that she changed the way I looked. It's that she changed the way I moved before I even understood what was happening, and once that started, I couldn't find my way back to the body I thought had always belonged to me. I still remember the exact moment I realized I was in trouble. Not danger, not exactly. Nothing dramatic. No music, no spotlight, no impossible event. Just a quiet Tuesday evening in a small apartment that smelled like laundry detergent and rain, and her voice from the doorway saying, very calmly, "Don't uncross your legs. You look more like yourself this way." I froze with a coffee mug halfway to my mouth. That sentence should have annoyed me. It should have embarrassed me. It should have made me laugh and roll my eyes and say, "What does that even mean?" But instead I stayed exactly as I was, knees pressed together, ankles angled to one side, shoulders unconsciously softened, and I felt something cold and electric pass through me. Because the truth was, I hadn't noticed I was sitting differently. My body had done it on its own. Or maybe not on its own. Maybe under her gaze. Maybe under the pressure of being seen. And when she said yourself, I felt that word land somewhere so deep inside me that I couldn't speak for a few seconds. That was the beginning, even though if I'm honest, the real beginning was years earlier. Maybe my whole life had been the beginning. Maybe some stories only make sense backward. At the time I was 29, living in a city where it was easy to disappear into routines. I worked at a mid-sized insurance office doing the kind of job people describe as stable when they don't want to call it deadening. My days were made of spreadsheets, polite emails, break room coffee, and the dull ache of pretending not to be disappointed by my own life. I had a lease, a gym membership I barely used, 3 button-down shirts in almost identical shades of blue, and a face people trusted because it looked calm even when I wasn't. I wasn't unhappy in any dramatic, visible way. That would have been easier. I wasn't falling apart. I was functioning. I was the kind of person relatives point to when they say, "He's doing well." I paid bills on time. I remembered birthdays. I laughed when expected. I never caused concern. And yet there was a private, unnameable discomfort under everything, as constant as a low electrical hum. I felt wrong in small ways all day long. The cut of my clothes. The weight of my steps. The way I occupied chairs. The shape I made in mirrors. The word, sir. The fact that other men seemed to move through their bodies like they had inherited them naturally, while I felt like I was renting mine and constantly worried about damaging it. I did what a lot of people do when they don't understand themselves. I turned confusion into habits. I kept my hair short because it was easier. I bought the clothes expected of me because they required no explanation. I let my voice drop at work because it made conversations smoother. I learned how to perform certainty in the same way you learn to smile for photographs. Not because it feels true, but because it prevents questions. Still, there were things I did in secret that I never let myself examine too closely. Late-night online shopping carts, I never checked out. Lingering too long in store aisles that weren't for me. A ridiculous level of focus on fabric textures. The strange peace I felt once, years before, when I had been alone in a hotel room during a conference and wrapped the white robe tight around myself, belted high at the waist, and caught my reflection from a distance. Not because I looked like a woman, exactly. I didn't. But because for one brief second, I looked less like the man I was expected to be, and that felt like air entering a locked room. I told myself it was stress. Curiosity. A phase that had somehow lasted from adolescence into adulthood, without ever becoming real enough to name. Then she moved in across the hall. Her name was Mara, and the first thing I noticed about her was how unhurried she seemed. Not slow, just unhurried, as if nobody had the power to rush her into being a version of herself she didn't want to be. She was a freelance illustrator, a few years older than me, with dark curls usually pinned up badly and a habit of wearing loose sweaters with paint on the sleeves. She laughed with her whole face. She talked to delivery drivers like they were old friends. She never seemed embarrassed by her own opinions. It wasn't that she was loud or particularly extroverted. It was something more unnerving than that. She was at ease in ways that made other people reveal themselves. We met because I helped her carry boxes upstairs on the day she moved in. She thanked me by bringing over half a lemon cake 2 days later on a ceramic plate she never seemed interested in getting back. Then there were hallway conversations, then coffee, then a strange but comfortable friendship that formed because both of us were home at odd hours, and both of us had apparently reached that age where making a new friend felt both rare and slightly miraculous. She was easy to talk to until she wasn't. What I mean is, most people let you hide by accepting your first answer. Mara didn't. If she asked how work was and I said, "Fine," she would tilt her head and wait. Not aggressively. Just patiently, with a kind of faith that there was more beneath the word and that I might actually survive saying it. The first few months of knowing her were dangerous in such small, almost invisible ways that I didn't recognize the risk. She got used to dropping by without notice. I got used to her sitting on my couch with her socked feet tucked under her, criticizing movies and redesigning brand logos in her sketchbook while I answered emails. It was domestic in the most innocent sense, and maybe that was why my guard lowered. Real danger, I had always imagined, would feel dramatic. But the things that change you most are often the things that make you feel safe enough to stop acting. I had one locked drawer in my bedroom. It held nothing scandalous by most standards. No one would have called the contents shocking on a grand scale. But they were mine and private, and so charged with shame that I treated that drawer like a bomb. Inside was a small collection of things accumulated over years and then hidden from myself as much as from anyone else. A soft cream blouse bought online and immediately regretted, a pair of black tights still in their package, 2 drugstore lipsticks in shades I never dared open fully, a simple knit dress folded so carefully it looked like evidence. I didn't wear them often. I barely wore them at all. That wasn't the point. The point was that owning them made something undeniable. No one knew about that drawer. At least that's what I believed until the day Mara came over while I was in the shower. I had told her to let herself in because she was borrowing a charger, and I assumed I'd be out in a minute. I was gone longer than I thought. When I came back to the living room, toweling my hair, she was sitting very still on the couch. The charger was on the table. So was the key to my bedroom drawer. For a second, my entire body seemed to go hollow. I had left the key in my jeans pocket. My jeans were on the bedroom floor. The drawer was slightly open. She looked up at me and didn't say anything right away. That silence was worse than anger would have been. Worse than mockery. Worse than shock. It let my imagination sprint ahead into every possible humiliation. I remember feeling heat climb my neck so fast it hurt. I remember thinking with absurd precision, I should have put on a shirt before walking in here. "I wasn't snooping," she said finally, and even then her voice was careful. "I knocked because your phone was buzzing in there. I saw the drawer open." I couldn't answer. I shouldn't have looked. Still nothing from me. My mind was racing, but my body had become almost unnaturally still, as if I moved too fast I might shatter. Then she asked the question that would have changed everything even if I had refused to answer it. "Do you want me to pretend I didn't see?" There are moments when your life divides itself, not because something huge happens, but because one sentence offers you a door and you understand, with terrifying clarity, that if you don't walk through it now, you may never get another chance. I should have said yes. That would have been the safe answer. Clean. Reversible. We both could have retreated into politeness. I could have spent the next year avoiding her eyes and maybe eventually moved apartments. She would have done me the kindness of silence. My life would have shrunk a little, but it would have remained recognizable. Instead, because panic makes fools and truth-tellers out of people, I said, "I don't know." The look on her face, then, is one I still think about. Not triumph, not pity, relief, almost, as if my not knowing was something human enough for her to hold. She nodded once. "Okay," she said. "Then I won't pretend. But I also won't decide what it means for you." I sat down because my knees felt unsteady. She didn't move closer. Didn't ask to see anything. Didn't ask why. She waited. Eventually, I said the first pathetic, defensive thing that came to mind. "It's not a sex thing." The second it left my mouth, I hated myself for saying it, hated the ugliness of needing to clarify that, hated the fact that shame had made me sound like someone in an interrogation room. "I didn't assume it was," she said. "I barely even wear any of it." "Okay. I don't know why I have it. That, at least, made her expression change. Not because she didn't believe me, but because she did. Maybe, she said carefully, you do know. Maybe you just don't trust your own answer. I laughed once, sharply, because that was too close and I needed it to miss. You make it sound simple.
No, she said.
I think it sounds terrifying. It was one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to me. After that, I expected awkwardness, but what settled between us instead was something more intimate and much harder to manage. Honesty with boundaries. She didn't bring it up casually. She didn't tease me or comfort me prematurely. She left me room to deny, deflect, disappear if I needed to. And, because she gave me that room, I kept stepping into it. Little by little. Not because I was brave. Because secrecy had finally become more exhausting than risk. A week later, I found myself in her kitchen at midnight, staring at the steam rising from 2 mugs of tea while telling her things I had never said out loud. I told her I had been fascinated by girls' clothes before I understood why. That when I was 13, I had gone through a phase of volunteering to help fold laundry just for the secret, aching relief of touching fabrics that felt soft and deliberate instead of stiff and practical. That when I was 16, I had stolen one of my mother's cardigans from a donation pile and hidden it in the garage for months, putting it on only when the house was empty. That wearing it didn't make me feel thrilled. It made me feel quiet, whole in some small, impossible way, which somehow felt worse, because if it had been only excitement or rebellion, maybe I could have outgrown it. I told her about trying on my college girlfriend's coat once while she was in another room, and then nearly being sick with shame when I saw myself in the mirror because I looked ridiculous and desperately hopeful at the same time. About how I had spent years policing every gesture afterward, as if the coat itself had exposed something contagious in me. About cutting my nails too short. About lowering my voice. About feeling like I was always making my body less interesting, less expressive, less me, in order to keep life smooth. I stopped there because I could hear how absurd I sounded. But she asked, when you imagine being caught, what are you actually afraid people would think? That took me longer to answer. Weak, I said at last. That was part of it. Not all of it, but enough to sting. She leaned back against the counter and looked at me for a long moment. You know what's strange, she said. Nothing you've told me sounds weak. It sounds controlled. Excessively controlled. Like you've spent years holding your own wrists. I wish I could explain what it felt like to hear someone describe your private misery so precisely. It was both a relief and an insult. Relief, because I wasn't invisible. Insult, because once seen, I couldn't maintain the dignity of calling it confusion. Nothing happened immediately after that conversation. There was no montage, no dramatic makeover, no sudden public revelation. Real change, at least in my life, moved in the shape of permission.
Small.
Repeatable. Hard to notice until there was too much of it to take back. A few days later she asked, in the most practical tone imaginable, do you want help figuring out what actually feels right, instead of hiding things you never wear in a drawer and letting them terrify you? I pretended not to understand. What does that mean? It means, she said, that if clothes are charged with all this fear, maybe you need less fantasy and more reality. Fabric.
Fit.
A mirror. Honesty. Not secrecy. I should have said no. Every defense mechanism I had was screaming. But underneath the fear was another feeling. Embarrassingly close to hope. Not hope that I would become someone else. Hope that I might finally stop circling the same private ache and see what was actually there. So I said yes. Even now, telling it like this, I can feel how my heart pounded that first evening. I had locked my apartment door, then checked it twice. I had closed the blinds though it was already dark. Mara stood in my bedroom with my hidden clothes spread across the bed, not laughing, not performing tenderness, just sorting. Efficient. Matter of fact. It should have made the whole thing less charged, but it only made it more real. This dress was never going to help you, she said, holding up the knit one. You bought a fantasy, not a fit. I know. The blouse is better. Tights maybe. But only if you stop acting like they're explosive material. Easy for you to say. She gave me a look. Do you want my help or my sympathy? I hated that I smiled. Help. Then listen to your body, not your panic. That line stayed with me. Listen to your body. The truth was, I had spent years doing the opposite. My body's preferences, its subtle leaning toward softness, quiet, grace, concealment, fluidity, had always been translated by my mind into danger. That night she made me stand in front of the mirror and do something I had almost never done honestly. Notice. Not whether I looked convincing. Not whether I looked feminine enough by some impossible standard. Just notice. How my shoulders dropped when I put on the blouse. How my breathing changed when the fabric skimmed my arms. How I instinctively held myself with more care. How I stopped, spreading my weight like I was trying to occupy space I hadn't earned. How, when she handed me the unopened lipstick and said, "Only if you want," my hands trembled not from excitement but from grief. Because suddenly I understood how much of my life had been spent denying myself tiny forms of comfort I couldn't justify. I looked awkward, of course. Tentative. A man in borrowed language. But I also looked softer in a way that startled me. My face, when I wasn't armoring it, had gentler lines than I thought. My eyes, without the usual tension in my brow, looked vulnerable in a way I associated with women because I had spent so long refusing that vulnerability in myself. I remember staring at my reflection with that cheap lipstick barely touched to my mouth, blouse hanging imperfectly, and saying, "I don't know what I am." Mara was behind me, leaning against the doorframe. "You don't have to know tonight, but this means something. Everything means something. That doesn't mean you need a final answer before you're allowed to breathe." Then she walked over, stood beside me in the mirror, and with 2 fingers adjusted my posture.
There.
Stop bracing. Your body keeps waiting to be accused. It was such a strange thing to hear that I nearly laughed, but she was right. Even alone, even with the door locked, I was standing like someone caught in a lie. That first night ended without revelation. I washed off the lipstick, folded the blouse, sat on the edge of the bed after she left, and felt a kind of trembling emptiness. I had expected either shame or relief. Instead, I felt both, layered together so tightly I couldn't separate them. The shame came from how much I had wanted that small experiment. The relief came from the fact that nothing catastrophic had happened. The world had not collapsed. No hidden camera had exposed me. Mara had not looked disgusted. I was still alive. More than that, I had seen myself in a way I could not unsee. Once something stops being abstract, it becomes harder to control. That was the dangerous part. The next time happened because I told myself I only wanted to check whether the first time had been a fluke. The third time happened because I had a difficult day at work and found myself craving the silence that came with stepping out of my usual clothes. The fourth happened because Mara texted, "Are you bracing again?" And I understood immediately what she meant. At work, I had become almost painfully aware of my own performance. The way I widened my stance when standing near other men. The way I laughed too roughly. The way I interrupted my own natural gestures halfway through, editing them in real time. Once you see yourself doing these things, it's hard not to feel ridiculous. I wasn't simply uncomfortable. I was actively curating discomfort as camouflage. That realization did not liberate me. It made me angry. I got angry at my father, though at the time I would have said I wasn't thinking about him. He had been a decent man in most obvious ways. Dependable, hardworking, never cruel in the theatrical sense. But he believed in manhood the way some people believe in weather, as an unquestionable condition to be endured properly. He disliked softness in boys with a weary contempt, as if softness were not evil but embarrassing. He was the kind of father who corrected posture, handshakes, tone. When I was 10, he once told me not to stand with my hands tucked against my stomach because you look like you're trying to disappear. I had dropped them so fast my shoulders hurt. He probably never imagined that sentence would stay in me for 20 years. But that's the thing about shame. It doesn't need violence. It only needs repetition and authority. Around that same time, my mother called to tell me my parents were visiting in 3 weeks. I nearly dropped the phone. They lived 2 hours away and didn't come often, but the timing alone felt like a threat. By then, my private experiments had acquired ritual. Sometimes Mara would help, sometimes not. Sometimes it was just a different shirt, a softer sweater, a pair of slim lounge pants bought from the women's section because I liked the drape and told myself no one would know. Sometimes it was sitting at my vanity mirror. Yes, I had bought a small mirror and then hated myself for how naturally it fit on my dresser, trying to understand what changes in presentation were about disguise and what changes were about recognition. I had also, somewhat accidentally, begun changing outside of clothing. I had stopped cutting my nails as short. I had let my hair grow enough to brush over my forehead. I had started moisturizing, which sounds trivial until I tell you how intimate it felt to touch my own face with care instead of treating it like a surface to maintain. Small changes. But parents are often experts in noticing anything that disrupts the archive they keep of who you are supposed to be. When I told Mara they were coming, she looked up from the sketchbook she was pretending to work in and said, "You're scared they'll see you." "No," I said too quickly. "They won't." That's not what I said. I sat on the arm of the couch and rubbed my palms together. "I'm not doing this around them, obviously." She closed the sketchbook. "I know. I can just put everything away for a few days. Can you?" I hated how good she was at asking calm questions with awful answers inside them. "I have before," I muttered. That's not the same as saying it costs nothing. I didn't answer, because I didn't want to admit how true that was. Every time I packed the clothes away, cut my movements back down, flattened myself into the version of me that passed most easily, I felt a little grief now. Not melodramatic grief. More like the feeling of leaving a warm room voluntarily, because you're afraid someone will see the lights on. My parents' visit was ordinary in all the ways that make ordinary things unbearable. My mother commented that my hair was getting long. My father asked if I had lost weight, which was his way of asking if I was all right without sounding tender. We went to lunch. We walked through a weekend street fair. We sat in my apartment afterward while my mother admired how tidy it was and my father stood at the window judging the weather. Nothing happened for hours, and that somehow made the tension worse. Then my mother asked if she could use my bathroom. You would think that wouldn't matter. But my bathroom had become one of the first places where I stopped pretending when alone. There was a tinted lip balm in the cabinet, a bottle of rosewater toner by the sink, a razor for body hair hidden badly behind spare towels because I had started, tentatively, shaving my legs below the knee where trousers would cover if necessary. Not for anyone else. Because the smoothness made me feel startlingly present in my skin. Because after the first time I did it, sitting on my bed and running my hand over my own calf, I nearly cried from how simple and right it felt. I got up so fast I hit my knee on the coffee table. "I need to grab something in there," I said, already moving. My mother looked puzzled. My father barely glanced over. I made it to the bathroom first and shoved the obvious items under the sink so clumsily that one bottle tipped over and leaked. When my mother came in a second later, I was wiping the counter with toilet paper like a criminal. She gave me a long look I couldn't read. "You okay?" she asked.
"Yeah."
"Just made a mess." She nodded slowly and closed the door. I stood outside that bathroom listening to the sound of running water and feeling my pulse in my throat. I can't fully explain what I was afraid of. Not exposure in any detailed sense. More the collapse of my ability to remain multiple people at once. If she had come out holding that lip balm, even innocently, the room would have changed shape. I would have had to lie or confess or laugh it off or watch her decide what kind of man her son was. And I wasn't ready for any of those versions of myself to exist in front of her. When she came out, she said nothing. But for the rest of the afternoon, I kept catching her looking at me in small, thoughtful ways. That frightened me more than if she had asked directly. After my parents left, I didn't feel relieved. I felt shaken. Exposed not by what happened, but by what almost might have. I sat in my apartment alone until evening, still wearing the men's sweater I'd chosen carefully that morning because it was neutral and forgettable, and I had a thought so sharp it made me stand up. I cannot keep living like a smuggler in my own life. It sounds dramatic now, but at the time it felt almost practical. I wasn't making a grand decision. I wasn't announcing an identity. I was simply recognizing that the current arrangement, half-hidden clothes, private rituals, constant tension, no language, was becoming impossible. So I went across the hall and knocked on Mara's door. When she opened it, I said, I need to go outside. She blinked. Outside? Like this, I said, though this at the moment was nothing remarkable. Soft black jeans that were technically from the women's section but visually ambiguous, an oversized oatmeal sweater that fell more gracefully than anything I used to buy, a little tinted moisturizer I had applied with absurd care and then nearly washed off 3 times. Not as me exactly. I don't know. Just not fully hidden. She studied me for half a second, taking in not the clothes but the terror. Okay, she said. Walk with me. The first time I went outside dressed in a way that felt even slightly honest, I thought every person on the street would stop and stare. That's the arrogance of fear. It imagines the whole world is waiting to confirm it. In reality, people were busy. A teenager glanced up from his phone and kept walking. A woman with a stroller smiled vaguely. A barista asked what name to put on my cup, and I panicked so hard I said my legal name in a voice that cracked. Still, it was the longest 15-minute walk of my life. Not because anything happened, because I happened, because my body moved differently when I wasn't forcing it to mimic something harsher. I took smaller steps. My arms stayed closer to me. My spine relaxed. I became hyper-aware of my own hands, my face, the tilt of my head when I listened. And because I was aware of these things, they became choices. Not fake choices. Revealed ones. At one point we passed a shop window, and I caught our reflections side by side. Mara in her paint-marked coat and careless bun. Me beside her, visibly nervous, visibly trying, visibly not the man I usually presented as. My first reaction was embarrassment. My second was an awful, aching tenderness toward myself. I looked frightened, but I also looked real. You're shaking, she said quietly once we were back in my apartment. I know. Do you regret it? I sat down, pressed both hands over my face, and started laughing. Not because anything was funny, because the pressure had nowhere else to go. No, I said from behind my hands. That's the problem. The months after that were the most destabilizing of my life, because progress does not come neatly. It comes in bursts, followed by backlash. I would take a step that felt honest, and then spend 2 days thinking I had ruined everything. I would buy something small, a cardigan, a pair of flats to wear only inside, a gentler coat, and then hide the shopping bag under other trash when taking it out so neighbors wouldn't see. I would practice makeup for 20 minutes and then scrub my face raw because I thought I looked absurd. I would feel calm and almost peaceful while shaving my legs and then hear a masculine laugh in the hallway outside my apartment and suddenly want to disappear. Mara helped, but she didn't rescue me from myself. That's important. She never told me what I was. She never demanded a label. She corrected me only when I started lying. One evening I said, maybe this is just about aesthetics. Maybe I just prefer some feminine things. She nodded. Maybe. I waited. That's it. She shrugged. What do you want me to say? I can't force you past the point you're willing to reach. I looked away. You think I'm afraid. I think you're bargaining. That stung because it was true. I spent months bargaining with myself. Maybe I only wanted privacy. Maybe I was just tired of masculinity as performance. Maybe this was a harmless side room in my life, not the house itself. And yet, every time I returned from that side room to ordinary life, I felt bereaved. The real complication entered through work. There was a woman in my department named Claire who had been there almost as long as I had. Smart, dry, impossible to impress, the sort of person who never spoke more loudly than necessary and therefore always got listened to. We weren't close, exactly, but we had that quiet office familiarity built over years of shared annoyance. She knew how I took my coffee. I knew which reports she hated. She had once told me, after a particularly awful meeting, you make a decent human shield, and it had somehow become a compliment. Around this time, she started looking at me strangely. Not hostile, curious. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then she cornered me in the copy room one afternoon and said, "Can I ask you something mildly rude?" Every muscle in me locked. "Your style changed," she said. Very subtly. Better sweaters. Skincare, maybe. Are you dating someone with taste? I laughed too quickly. Something like that. She looked at me for another second, then gave the smallest smile. Whatever it is, you seem less miserable. That should not have affected me as much as it did. But it did because it meant someone had noticed not only the external shifts but the internal one. Less miserable. I carried those words home like contraband. The next week, a disaster almost happened. I had begun keeping a small pouch in my work bag with lip balm, concealer, and a compact mirror, not because I was presenting openly, but because once you start allowing yourself care, it becomes harder to live without it. One evening, I was in the office restroom after most people had left, touching up the faint shine on my face before heading home. When the door opened, Claire walked in. I snapped the compact shut, so fast I dropped it. For one hideous second, we just stared at each other in the mirror. Then she stepped into the restroom fully, let the door close behind her, and said, very evenly, "I'm going to wash my hands and not act weird unless you need me to." I cannot describe the amount of gratitude packed into that sentence. I bent to pick up the compact and nearly hit my head on the counter. "Thanks," I muttered. She washed her hands, dried them. Then, while still facing the sink, said, "For what it's worth, your blending is better than mine was when I started." I looked up so fast I caught her eye in the mirror. She met my stare. "I'm not comparing situations," she said. "Just saying I recognize a panic face." Then she left. I stood in that restroom for a full minute after she was gone, staring at my own reflection and feeling the world rearrange itself again. Because suddenly there was another witness. Another person who knew something not fully defined. And unlike Mara, whose knowledge belonged to my private life, Claire existed in the sphere I had worked hardest to keep stable. I considered quitting. Truly. For 2 days I fantasized about resigning, changing cities, resetting my life, before anything got more complicated. That fantasy told me everything I needed to know about how much I had to lose and how much I was already unwilling to abandon. On the 3rd day, Claire dropped a printed report on my desk and said, without looking at me, "There's a new cafe 2 blocks over. If you ever need a place where no one cares what anyone is doing with their face, it's useful." Then she walked away. I did not go immediately. But a week later, I found myself there on a Saturday afternoon, sitting by the window in a soft gray top, clear gloss on my lips, hair brushed carefully, heart pounding. I had chosen the cafe because it was far enough from my neighborhood to feel less risky. I had also chosen it because I wanted to test something, whether I could exist in public without Mara as my escort, without the excuse of being accompanied. Nobody stared. Nobody pointed. A teenage cashier complimented my sweater. An older woman asked if the seat beside me was free. The ordinariness of the experience nearly undid me. I kept waiting for the hidden trap, the laughter, the recognition, the moment someone would look too long and my body would become a spectacle. It never happened. Instead, I sat there holding a mug with both hands and felt, slowly, the terrible possibility that I might deserve a life larger than secrecy. That possibility is terrifying because once you feel it, you also understand the cost of refusing it. Around then, Mara asked me if I had thought about a different name. I reacted badly. Much too badly. Why would I need a different name? She didn't flinch. "You don't need anything." I asked if you'd thought about it. "It's ridiculous." That would mean...
What?
I stood up, suddenly restless. "It would mean this is going somewhere." She was sitting at my kitchen table, watching me with infuriating calm. "It is going somewhere."
No.
"It's just, I'm figuring things out." That's still a direction. I turned away, because anger was easier than fear. "You want this to be simpler than it is." "No," she said softly. "I think you want it to be smaller than it is." I wish I could say I handled that conversation maturely. I didn't. I told her she was pushing me. I accused her of seeing patterns that weren't there. I said I never asked to become some kind of project. The second those words left my mouth, I regretted them, because the hurt on her face was immediate and quiet. "You're right," she said after a moment. "You didn't." She gathered her mug and coat and left. The silence afterward was unbearable. For 4 days we barely spoke. I told myself I deserved the distance. I also hated it. More than that, I discovered something ugly about myself in those days. I had begun relying on her not just for help but for permission. Without her steady gaze, my confidence collapsed into old habits.
I
Stopped using the mirror, cut my nails down again, pulled on rougher clothes. It felt like trying to re-inhabit a house after all the furniture had been removed. Nothing fit the way it used to. On the 5th day, I knocked on her door. When she opened it, I said, "You were right and I'm sorry." She folded her arms. "About which part?" "All of it," I said, then laughed weakly. "Especially the part where I turned my panic into your fault." That softened her. "Not fully, but enough." "I'm not trying to drag you anywhere," she said. "I know. I just don't want to help you lie to yourself more elegantly." That line hit hard because it described exactly what I had been doing, improving the costume of avoidance instead of confronting it. So, I asked the question I had been afraid to ask. What if I'm not just cross-dressing? She held my gaze. Then, that's not a crime. The room went very still. No one had said it that plainly before. Not that it was some terrible secret I was almost, maybe perhaps not allowing myself to touch. I sat down on her couch because my legs felt weak. "I don't know what I want," I admitted. "Sometimes I think I just want softness. Sometimes I think I want people to see me differently. Sometimes I think I want to disappear and come back as someone else entirely. And sometimes I think I'm inventing all of it because I'm lonely or dissatisfied or, I don't know, broken in a boring way." Mara came and sat opposite me, elbows on knees. Wanting to be seen differently is not trivial. Wanting to feel at home in your body is not trivial. And if you keep dismissing yourself every time the answer gets larger, you'll spend your whole life calling your own truth an exaggeration. I looked down at my hands. "I'm scared if I admit too much. I can't take it back." "That's true," she said. There was no comfort in that, which is why I trusted it. After that, things deepened in ways that were not always visible from the outside. I stopped thinking only in terms of clothing. Clothing had opened the door, but it was no longer the whole room. I started paying attention to pronouns in my own private thoughts, not trying to force anything, just noticing. Sometimes when I imagined myself at peace, the image in my mind was a male. It wasn't perfectly defined either, but it leaned. It had always leaned. I had just spent years correcting the angle before I could see it. I let my hair grow further, learned how to shape my brows more gently, bought a proper foundation match after 3 humiliating attempts, started voice exercises alone in the car, then abandoned them, then tried again. There was something so intimate and destabilizing about hearing my own voice shift, even slightly upward or soften at the edges. It made me feel fraudulent one minute and deeply relieved the next. I kept waiting for some absolute certainty to descend. Instead, I got layers of recognition, each one incomplete, but undeniable. The first time Mara used she for me, it was an accident. At least I think it was. We were in her apartment, surrounded by clothes she had pulled from a consignment haul for me to try, because she insisted department stores made me panic and secondhand shops had better textures anyway. I was standing in front of her mirror in a dark green wrap dress that actually fit, really fit, for the first time in my life. Not perfect, not magical, but right enough that when I looked up I forgot to brace. Mara, rummaging through a basket of scarves, said, "She needs better shoes with that." Time stopped. She looked up immediately. I saw the moment she realized what she'd said. Neither of us moved. Then she asked, very quietly, "Did that feel bad?" I had to swallow before I could answer.
No.
It came out more like a confession than a response.
No.
It hadn't felt bad. It had felt dangerous and warm and like standing on the edge of something immense. I was so overwhelmed I had to sit down. Mara didn't rush to fill the silence. She just crouched in front of me and touched my knee lightly, asking permission with her eyes before touching at all. That simple care nearly broke me. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered. She nodded. "I know. I don't know if I can not do it either." She squeezed my knee once. That's usually the more important answer. For a while after that, my life split into concentric circles. In the innermost circle, with Mara, and increasingly with myself, I was beginning to admit that femininity was not a costume for me. It was not an occasional private release. It was a language I was learning because my body had been trying to speak it for years. In the next circle, with Claire, things remained unnamed but less hidden. She started inviting me to things in spaces that felt safer: an arts market, a bookstore event, a quiet bar where nobody paid much attention to anyone else. She never asked intrusive questions. Once, while we were walking back to the train after a gallery opening, she said, "You know you don't owe anyone a dramatic reveal, right? Some people think if a person changes visibly, there has to be a speech. There doesn't." I looked at her. "Did you give one?" She smiled without humor. "Only to the people who had earned it." There was comfort in that too. The idea that identity did not need to become performance just because it had once been hidden. The outermost circle was work, family, the rest of the world. And that circle began to strain. The first real rupture came at the office holiday dinner. I almost didn't go, but skipping it would have drawn attention, and part of me, some reckless or exhausted part, was tired of shrinking. So I compromised. I wore black trousers with a softer drape than usual, a silk blouse under a blazer, light makeup subtle enough to be deniable, hair styled instead of simply combed. I told myself it was still within the range of plausible masculine fashion if viewed kindly. That turned out to depend heavily on who was viewing. Most people either didn't notice or were too polite to say anything. Then one of the senior analysts, a man named Brent whose personality was basically an expensive watch trying to become a person, looked me up and down while holding a glass of wine and said, laughing, "New look, Daniel. Very European." A few people nearby smiled uncertainly. You could feel the room deciding whether it was safe to join him. I felt the old shame rise so fast it almost blurred my vision. Then Claire, who was standing beside me, said in a tone of perfect mildness, "That's a relief. For a second I thought he looked better than you, and I'd have hated for that to be accidental." A small burst of laughter went around the group, this time at Brent's expense. He smirked, shrugged, and turned away. The moment passed, but my hands were shaking under the table for 10 minutes afterward. In the restroom later, I stared at myself in the mirror and thought, this is how it begins. Not with headlines. With comments designed to remind you that your body is public the moment it stops obeying expectation. I nearly scrubbed my face clean again. Instead, I walked back out. That mattered. Not because it was brave in any cinematic way. Because for most of my life, shame had been a command. That night, for perhaps the first time, it was only a feeling. Still, there were costs. I became quieter at work, more watchful. I noticed which colleagues were warm, which were brittle, which performed tolerance only when it required nothing. I also noticed how exhausting it was to manage ambiguity. Some days I wanted desperately to stop being read as male. Other days I used that default reading as protection because I was too tired to correct anyone. The inconsistency made me feel dishonest, even though it was actually just survival. The larger crisis arrived through my mother. She called one Sunday evening and said, "I was thinking of visiting next weekend."
Just me.
My stomach dropped.
Why?
There was a pause. Do I need a reason? No, of course not. But the answer, unmistakably, was yes. She had a reason. I spent the next 6 days in a state so anxious it bordered on physical illness. Mara offered to help me prepare, which was kind and useless because how do you prepare to be seen by the person who knew you first? By the person whose idea of you still includes your childhood face? I considered hiding everything again. Then I considered the bathroom incident, the thoughtful looks, the possibility that she already suspected more than I knew. Pretending suddenly felt both safer and more unbearable. When she arrived, she hugged me longer than usual. That frightened me immediately.
We made tea. We talked about ordinary things.
The weather. My aunt's surgery. Some problem with the gutters at their house. Then she set down her cup and said, very gently, "Are you happy?" Of all the questions she could have asked, that one devastated me. I laughed once, trying to buy time. That's a big question. I know. I'm okay. She looked at me in that maddening maternal way that suggested she could hear the edits in my sentence.
You've changed, she said.
I said nothing. You seem, She searched for a word. More fragile, but also less shut down. I don't know how to explain it. My throat tightened. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe. She hesitated. I found a lip balm in your bathroom last time. There it was. The whole room seemed to narrow around that sentence. I almost asked about it, she continued. Then I thought if you wanted me to know something, you'd tell me. And if I didn't, she held my gaze. Then I'd wait. That was the moment I understood something painful and obvious. My mother was not my father. I had been rehearsing his judgment inside her silence. I wish I could say I told her everything cleanly. I didn't. I stumbled. Started too far back. Minimized. Corrected myself. I said I had been exploring things. I said I didn't know exactly what it meant. I said I felt more like myself when I allowed femininity into my life. I said the word crossdressing first because it felt smaller, then sat there sick with the knowledge that it was not large enough. Finally I said, almost in a whisper, I think I may not be the son you think I am. I actually corrected the grammar mid-sentence because I was so panicked and she noticed. Her eyes filled instantly. Not with disgust. With grief, maybe, but not the kind I feared. More the grief of realizing someone you love has been alone for a very long time. Oh, sweetheart, she said. That nearly undid me. Not because it solved anything. Because I had expected interrogation and received sorrow. She asked careful questions. Not always perfect ones. Did I want to be a woman? Had I felt like this forever? Was I safe? Did anyone else know? Was I in some kind of trouble? There were moments that hurt. When she said, I just don't want you making your life harder, I snapped. Do you think I'm doing this because it's convenient? She flinched, and I immediately apologized. We were both clumsy. Both trying. Then she asked, Is there a different name you want? I stared at her. The fact that Mara had asked months earlier and I'd reacted like a trapped animal, now my mother was asking with tears in her eyes and a tremor in her voice. Life does not let you prepare for symmetry. I don't know, I admitted. She nodded. Okay. No pressure. No performance of instant understanding. Just okay. When she left that evening, she hugged me again at the door and whispered, I need time, but I'm here. I stood there after she walked away, hand still on the knob, and cried so hard I had to slide down to the floor. My father, however, was another matter. He called 3 days later. Not because my mother had betrayed me, exactly. She had told him something because she believed secrets of that magnitude should not become poison between spouses. I don't blame her for that, though at the time I felt raw and furious. His voice on the phone was too controlled, which I recognized from childhood as a bad sign. Your mother says you're confused, he said. Confused. Not changing. Not telling us something important. Confused, as if I were a lost hiker. I'm figuring things out, I said carefully. What things? There was no safe answer. I took one breath too few and said, gender. Silence. Then a disbelieving exhale. Jesus. I closed my eyes. What followed was not a screaming fight. In some ways that would have been easier. It was worse because it was restrained. He asked if someone had put ideas in my head. He asked if this was because I spent too much time alone. He asked if I understood what people would think. And threaded through everything was the same old disgust for softness, now polished into concern. He kept returning to variations of one sentence. I just don't see why you'd choose this. That word again. Choose. At one point I said, very quietly, do you think I'd choose to be terrified of my own life? He had no answer to that. Only silence. Then, finally, you're still my kid, but I don't know what to do with this. It wasn't acceptance, but it also wasn't disowning. It was, in a painful way, honest. And honesty, even flawed honesty, gave us something to work with. Still, after that call, I was wrecked. I spent the night pacing my apartment, then ended up at Mara's door after midnight. When she opened it and saw my face, she just stepped aside and let me in. I told her everything. The phone call, the word confused, the exhaustion of having my inner life translated into pathology. She listened, then handed me a blanket because I was shivering without noticing. "I hate that he can still do this to me," I said. "I'm almost 30. One conversation, and I feel 13 again." "Of course you do," she said. "He taught you what was punishable." That sentence sat in the room like a bell. Punishable.
Yes.
That was the word my nervous system had been using for years, even when my conscious mind preferred softer ones. "What if he never gets it?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Then he loses parts of you. That will be sad. It will not make you unreal." I wish healing arrived all at once after moments like that. It doesn't. But something solidified in me during that season of friction. I had spoken to my mother. I had survived my father's disappointment. I had begun taking up slightly more honest space in public. There was no longer a version of the future where I simply returned to before. That realization brought not peace, but momentum. I started therapy. I need to say that plainly because otherwise this story might sound like it unfolded through intuition alone, and it didn't. I needed someone trained enough to help me separate fear from truth, shame from preference, fantasy from identity. My therapist, whose name was Nina, had the deeply inconvenient habit of asking simple questions that exposed the architecture of my avoidance. Questions like, when do you feel most at ease in your body? And if no one could punish you for the answer, what would you want? And once, after I spent 10 minutes describing how impossible transition seemed, are you trying to decide whether something is right or whether it is easy? Little by little, under her guidance, and with Mara's stubborn steadiness and Claire's quiet solidarity, I stopped phrasing my life as an apology. I also chose a name, not in some cinematic flash. It arrived over time, like a note I kept hearing beneath other sounds. Elena. I don't even know why at first. I tried it in my journal, then in my head. Then Mara said it once in my kitchen while handing me a mug. "Here, Elena, before you faint from overthinking," and my body reacted before my mind could argue. Relief. Immediate, involuntary, almost painful. That was when I knew. Names are strange. They are both symbol and tool. They do not magically solve identity, but they create a place to stand. When I started hearing Elena in safe spaces, I understood how much Daniel had become a shell that let me move through the world with fewer questions and greater emptiness. The hardest part of choosing a name was not hearing it. It was realizing I wanted others to use it. That is where private truth starts demanding public consequences. I told Claire first after Mara. We were at the cafe, with the scratched wooden tables and indifferent lighting. I had rehearsed the sentence all morning and still almost failed to say it. Finally, I blurted, "I think I have a different name." Claire set down her cup. "Okay. It's Elena." She smiled, not huge, not dramatic, just warm. "That suits you." I laughed shakily. "You're saying that like it's obvious." "It is now." Then, because she was Claire, she added, "Do you want me to use it here only, or are we entering a spreadsheet phase of your life where contexts matter?" That made me laugh for real, which was exactly what I needed. The first time hearing Elena at work happened by accident. We were alone in a conference room going over a report when Claire, distracted, said, "Elena, can you pull up the—" She stopped dead. I looked at her. She winced. "Sorry, but I was smiling before I meant to."
No.
"It's okay." That was the first moment someone used my name in the place that scared me most. No audience. No spectacle. Just a conference room, a spreadsheet, fluorescent lights, and the sudden knowledge that I could exist there too. The official coming out at work happened months later and was awful in all the ordinary ways. Meetings with HR, forms, explanations. The careful administrative language of identity translated into systems. Some people were kind.
Some awkward.
A few went stiff with polite resistance. Brent, predictably, made one comment too many and got corrected not by me but by my manager, which felt better than I expected. My email signature changed. My name in the directory changed. Pronouns in meetings shifted with varying accuracy. The first week afterward, I went home each day so exhausted I could barely speak. Not because being Elena was exhausting, because being seen becoming Elena was. Still, each night, When I took off my shoes in the hallway and caught my reflection in the darkened window, I felt a little more coherence, a little less splitting. My relationship with my mother grew unexpectedly stronger in that period. She stumbled, asked clumsy questions, forgot and corrected herself, cried once in a department store fitting room while helping me choose a coat because, in her words, I miss too much and I don't know where to begin. I told her she was beginning right there. That was enough. It had to be. My father remained difficult. He used my old name for too long, avoided pronouns altogether, spoke of all this, as if identity were weather passing through. But then, one afternoon nearly a year after that first terrible phone call, I visited my parents and found that my mother had labeled the guest bathroom basket with a little handwritten tag that said Elena's things, because she had bought me a hairbrush to keep there. It was such a small gesture, almost embarrassingly small, yet I had to go stand in the bathroom alone and breathe through sudden tears. When I came back out, my father was at the kitchen table pretending to read the newspaper. He didn't look up when he said gruffly, "Your mother thought maybe you'd want your own things here." Not Elena. Not yet. But not son. Not confusion. Not mockery. It was the closest thing to care he knew how to offer in that moment, and I learned then that acceptance can arrive wearing rough clothes. I should also say this. Not every part of my transformation felt noble or pure. There were days of vanity, of obsession, of chasing control through details because identity felt too large to hold directly. I spent stupid amounts of time watching makeup tutorials and then crying because my face did not behave like the faces on screen. I compared myself cruelly to other women, trans and cis alike. I mourned years I couldn't get back. I got angry at strangers for effortless things they had never asked me to witness. I hated my reflection some mornings. Other mornings I loved it for reasons so fragile, I was afraid to move. There were losses too. An old college friend stopped returning messages after I told him. An uncle made a joke at Christmas that silenced the room. I learned which acquaintances supported me only in abstract terms. I learned how often people confuse curiosity with entitlement. I learned that some forms of kindness are actually surveillance. But I also learned joy in ways I had not thought possible. Quiet joy. Not performative. The joy of putting on clothes in the morning that did not feel like a disguise. The joy of hearing Elena from across a room and turning instinctively. The joy of sitting with other women and not feeling like I was imitating an entire species from the outside. The joy of no longer negotiating every movement like it might betray me. The joy of softness that was no longer contraband. And, maybe most surprisingly, I learned that the title of the story, the thing I once feared most, that she controlled my body, was never the truth at all. It only felt that way in the beginning because I had never before let anyone witness the part of me that wanted out. Mara didn't control my body. She noticed it. She noticed what it reached toward when I stopped punishing it. She noticed the way I folded inward under scrutiny and unfolded under permission. She told me when I was bracing. She adjusted a shoulder, corrected a posture, handed me a blouse, said a name. From the outside, or from the perspective of my panic, it felt like she was directing me. Really, she was interrupting the old directions long enough for my own body to speak. Once I understood that, everything changed. The last near discovery, the one that finally made me feel the past loosen its grip, happened in the least glamorous place imaginable, a supermarket on a Thursday night. I was there after work, tired, hair falling out of its clip, makeup half worn away, carrying a basket with soup, laundry pods, and oranges. Nothing dramatic. Nothing curated. I turned down the cereal aisle and almost walked straight into a man from my father's town, someone who had known me since childhood. The kind of local family acquaintance who remembers your school photos and asks what you do now with faint disappointment no matter the answer.
He looked at me.
I looked at him. For one electric second I thought, here it is. Exposure. Explanation. Collapse. Then he smiled politely in the generic way strangers do when navigating around each other's carts, and kept going. He did not know me. I stood there with my hand on a box of cereal, heart pounding. It was such a stupid, ordinary moment. But in that instant I understood that I had crossed some invisible threshold. Not because I was unrecognizable exactly, but because I no longer existed mainly in relation to the person I had been expected to remain. The old archive had lost its authority over the present body. I went home and told Mara, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. "You're telling me your grand revelation happened by the oats?" "Yes," I said. "Apparently liberation is deeply uncinematic." She wiped her eyes. "That sounds right, honestly." By then our friendship had changed too. It had survived my fear, my resentment, my dependence, my gratitude. We were no longer in that strange phase where she felt like the keeper of a door. She was just Mara again, which was another kind of grace. The person who had witnessed the beginning without needing to own the outcome. One night not long after, we were on my couch watching some terrible detective show, and she glanced over and said, "You know, you move differently now." I smiled. "You said that before." "No, I mean really differently. Not more feminine, exactly. More inhabited." That word stayed with me. Inhabited. Maybe that is the simplest way to explain everything. Before, I lived in my body like a tenant terrified of leaving marks on the walls. Now I live in it like someone unpacking slowly, still learning the rooms, still surprised by the light, but no longer apologizing for being there. If I'm honest, there are still moments when the old fear returns. A clerk using the wrong name because an old card is still in the system. A family gathering where history hangs in the air like
dust.
A man's glance on public transit that lasts a beat too long. There are mornings when I look in the mirror and see all the work still undone, all the traces of a life spent moving against my own grain. Transition, whatever exact form it takes for a person, does not erase history. It teaches you how to carry it without letting it narrate everything. Sometimes I think back to that first sentence from Mara in my apartment, the one about not uncrossing my legs. At the time it felt invasive, almost supernatural, as if she had reached inside me and found a secret switch. Now I understand it differently. She had simply seen a truth in motion. My body, relieved for a second from surveillance, had chosen itself. And she was brave enough to say so. The strangest part of all this is how ordinary my life is now from the outside. I still work. I still pay bills. I still buy detergent and forget to answer texts and stand in line at pharmacies under bad lighting. The drama was never in becoming a spectacle. It was in ceasing to live as a ghost. My mother calls me Elena now, without hesitation. The first few times my father did it, his voice sounded stiff, almost formal, like he was wearing a suit that didn't fit. Then one day he left me a voicemail after a storm warning and said, "Elena, call when you get this, so I know you're all right." No strain. No pause. Just my name, wrapped in concern so habitual he forgot to defend himself against it. I listened to that message 3 times. Claire got promoted and moved to another department, but we still meet at the cafe when schedules allow. Last winter, she told me, over burnt coffee and a muffin neither of us wanted. "For what it's worth, you seem less like a person surviving herself." "That sounds very flattering," I said. "It's the nicest thing I've ever said. Don't waste it." Mara still borrows my scarves and never returns them. We still fight sometimes, though now it's over normal things like lateness and whether one can make soup without tasting it. The extraordinary has dissolved into the fabric of ordinary life, which is probably the happiest ending I could have imagined. I used to think transformation would feel like crossing a finish line. Clean, obvious, irreversible in a single moment. It didn't. It felt like hundreds of tiny permissions accumulating until the old prohibitions could no longer hold. It felt like buying a lip balm and not hiding it, like hearing the right name in a conference room, like surviving a cruel joke without shrinking, like telling my mother the truth in my own kitchen, like standing in a supermarket aisle and realizing the past had failed to catch me. There are parts of my old life I mourn. Years spent armoring myself. Relationships shaped by a role I was playing so well that even I believed it sometimes. The softness I mistook for weakness. The body I treated like a suspect. I can't get those years back. I can only be honest about what they cost. If I sound calm now, don't mistake that for simplicity. This is still the deepest, most frightening, most humbling thing that has ever happened to me. To let your life become visible to itself is not easy. To be changed by that visibility is even harder. There were nights I lay awake convinced I was ruining everything. There were mornings I put on the old version of myself because I needed a day without explanation. There were tears in fitting rooms, in parking lots, in office restrooms, in my therapist's waiting room, in my parents' guest bathroom, in front of mirrors that showed me both too much and not enough. But there were also moments so quiet and true that I would go through all of it again for them. The first time I caught myself humming while getting dressed because I wasn't negotiating with my reflection. The first time a stranger called me ma'am, and I didn't spend the next hour analyzing whether she really meant it. The first time my mother handed me a sweater at her house and said, "This color is better on you than on me." The first time my father, awkward and sincere, asked if I wanted help carrying boxes and then added, "Careful, Elena, that one's heavier than it looks." The first time I looked in the mirror late at night, face washed clean, hair messy, no performance left, and still recognized the person staring back. That might be the truest ending I can give you. Not a perfect image. Not a triumphant reveal. Just a mirror at the end of a long day and the absence of panic. For so many years, I thought the worst thing that could happen was being seen. Now I know the worst thing would have been never allowing myself to become visible at all. And if you're wondering about her, about the woman who seemed to control my body, who told me how to sit and stand and dress and stop bracing, what I know now is this: she didn't put anything into me. She stood beside me long enough that I could stop mistaking recognition for control. She gave language to movements that were already mine. She held up a mirror without forcing me to look into it before I was ready. She was there the first time I let my shoulders drop, the first time I wore softness without apology, the first time I heard my real name and didn't flinch. But the final movement, the one that changed everything, was mine. It was mine the night I chose not to hide the lip balm. Mine when I returned to the office dinner after being mocked. Mine when I told my mother the truth with shaking hands. Mine when I said Elena aloud and understood I could not unknow it. Mine when I stopped calling my own longing confusion just because fear preferred that word. Mine when I crossed my legs without thinking and, instead of correcting myself, let my body stay where it wanted to stay. That is the secret at the center of all of this. I was never losing control. I was surrendering a false kind of control, the brittle one built on punishment and performance so that something deeper could finally live. I used to think a life had to be justified before it could be inhabited. Now I think the opposite is true. You inhabit it first. You listen. You risk. You let the body you've been silencing speak in gestures before it has theory, in comfort before it has language, in tears before it has certainty. You discover that truth is often less like a lightning strike and more like a hand unclenching, finger by finger, until you realize how much pain it took to stay closed. I am still opening. Maybe I always will be. But I'm opening as myself now, and that has changed everything.